everyone, and welcome to the Beauty in Between podcast. I'm Gabe, and this is my wonderful wife, Katie. Hi, Katie.
Hello, everyone.
And today, before jumping into today's episode, we just want to do a quick check-in, seeing what we're bringing to the table this time and bringing to the space. So how have you been doing? What have you been enjoying doing, or different things that you've been exploring recently?
Yeah, well, I'm enjoying, at the time of this recording, stepping into a slower season of work. There's still so many things to do, and I feel like I'm at that point of the year where I have like a running task list of things that I need to optimize or create or edit or tweak, or like I feel like I have a running to-do list. But at the same time, I'm trying to just like step into each day and just actually being present, like in this moment with you. And I have my coffee that I will have on camera because I need to finish this. I've also been enjoying recently reading a book series called The Legend-Born Cycle that started out as it was only supposed to be 2 books, and I am finishing the 3rd one. And then I learned when I started the 3rd one that apparently the publishers approved a 4th book. So now I thought I was going to be done with the whole series after this 3rd one, and I was very excited. But now I'm in the last like 100 or so pages, and I know that I'm not going to be able to start reading the 4th book until sometime next year, and that pains me. But I guess, you know, the Marvel movies have trained me well enough. Like, I'll wait. It'll be fine. But I will say, The Legend-Born Cycle, highly recommend. It is such a great series if you enjoy fantasy and like magic realism, and I don't know. I just like that it's a fantasy book written by a really intelligent, really great writer who is a woman of color. And it takes place in the South. There's a scene with the Waffle House. So
I forgot
I'm
about
still riding on the fumes of the fact that there was a whole Waffle House scene in this book. So that's what I've been focused on. What about you?
I've had a little bit of a running list too of things because with my work, we have 2 different cohorts that are, they're meeting on 2 different days, but it's 3 cohorts. And so checking off all the things to get that done, and also having a lunch and learn today. So I'm going to be running around, and with my boss, it was like, oh, I guess we don't have to have that long of a meeting because we're going to see each other almost every day this week. So that's a fun time.
Woo!
But yeah, so once we get past this week, though, then I'll be kind of in the planning mode and seeing the different optimization for stuff and being able to take a little bit of a step back and being like, okay, now that I've been in this for a couple of months, where do we want to take this? Which is exciting.
We can optimize together.
Yes, side by side.
Wow. We have literally been working side by side on a couch. That's been kind of fun.
It has been fun.
And also funny because we haven't both had a work from home job where we are both working from the couch, I think, ever. So it's a fun time, everybody.
Yeah, but there are also times where I have to be like, hello, Katie, can you help me with this? Or like, you've been doing this for a little bit longer. Can you give me some advice on this? Or
So jumping into the episode today, because I have no smooth transition. My transition is acknowledging that I don't have a transition. So today we are talking about, how our stories shape us. I went through so many iterations of throwing the title of this episode out to you in my own brain. I think I even talked to ChatGPT about it. And I want to share a little bit just with our listeners, or viewers for that matter, potentially, about the idea that we really wanted to capture not just the essence of the importance of your story, but even the language of story, including doing our best to sort of include all that has built us up into who we are up to this present points. In my case, there's like divorces in my family that are all part of it, familial norms, cultural, race, ethnicity, where we're trying to cover essentially a wide swath. And our hope and our heart in sort of building out this episode is the idea of, again, covering a lot of territory, but really engaging with what does it mean to honor all of those aspects of our story. Not necessarily by talking about every single thread super duper in depth, but at least the idea of showing the sort of the integrated nature of our stories. We are complex, complicated, multifaceted human beings. And so, I just wanted to do our best to sort of engage in this element of identity, because essentially this one episode could be broken into its own season. So we did this instead.
And there are a lot more people that will talk about storytelling in just a very detailed aspect. And that is something that we definitely value super hardcore.
Hmm.
And so having to cram it
Super
in, like,
hardcore.
we have times where we practice, trying to get it down to like a 5 minute or a 2 minute or 10 minute story. And so it's hard sometimes.
Yeah, and
There's a lot of information to pack.
and even the thing about this episode too is that there's even the sort of like implicit question that I think sometimes people will consider it, but it's not typically out there in the open, and it generally isn't really out there in the open to be talked about within church spaces, is like even the question of how have we been taught
Mhm.
explicitly and implicitly by all of the streams, in this case of our stories, so all the streams of our family, what have we been taught to talk about our cultural, our ethnic, our racial, our family roots? Because whether we like it or not, we inherit norms from age 0. You begin taking in information of what does it mean? What are the norms? What's okay? What's acceptable? What's unacceptable to talk about? And an example from one side of my family just popped into my brain, but I'm not going to share it because that would be going too deep. Talk to me in real life and we'll talk about that. But so in the heart of just sort of
I'll talk about that afterwards.
jumping into those topics, Gabe, giving you the floor for a bit. How has your family's cultural story, broader story in general, shaped the way that you see yourself today?
Well, something I guess, whenever we're talking about story, the first thing that popped in my head whenever we're going through the subject of like things that are encouraged or discouraged whenever we're kind of storytelling or talking about our testimony even is
Testimony.
yeah, is just this idea of like even at church this last week we were talking about our pastor, well, the new pastor who is I guess he's a preacher, not a pastor for the church.
Sure.
Anyways, but he mentioned the idea of like, generational curses, and I was even
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it, but also being able to be a generational blessing in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
where you have these stories of like forefathers where it's like you're going to be a blessing among these nations and among these generations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that I don't know, it's like really highlighted in my mind is the fact that having your story and your culture can put a lot of pressure on us a lot of times. Like for me, there is this idea where, something that I held on to a lot whenever I was a kid growing up.
Mm-hmm.
My both sides of my family have kind of dealt with addiction. And my parents had, their own cases of that. And so in my life, my mom really wanted to give me a different life, and wanted me to not go through the same things that she went through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my dad would, definitely say the same thing
Yeah.
now.
Which
But
also, by the way, to
yeah.
like jump in really quickly, I think I mean, even just the general of like not a parent, I say this not being a parent, but having pastored to many parents, like
Mhm.
I think the general heart and energy of like parents in one way or the other, not wanting their kids to either go through, not have to go through the same things that they did, or like fully overcompensating to just like put them in a super bubble
Mhm.
to just not experience hardship is like, that's a typical thing. And even
Yeah.
more so, I think, in some ways for like immigrant communities, especially like first and second gen,
Mhm.
which we can get to in
For
my
sure.
story. But yes, totally
Yeah.
understandable is basically what I'm
Yeah, for
saying.
sure. No, no, no. I think it's definitely like coming from a good place where
Right.
you don't want your kid to have to suffer through the same things and go through because you've seen the result of what those things have produced in you.
Right. Right.
And so like your kid is going to go through something, but you're trying to protect them from as many things as possible.
Hmm.
But with that, like there were generational curses that were being broken with my parents' generation, with my generation. And
Hmm.
so, but I did feel this kind of pressure of like, man, I don't want to make the same mistakes my parents made.
Hmm.
And that was a big thing that affected my life and even affects me now is like this idea of just trying not to mess up.
Mm.
And
Back to the round table.
yeah, that's sort of
That's so real and
burdensome
so
mindset where
hard.
you're trying not to take this wrong detour and you think, oh man, if I like stay on the right path or if I like follow the GPS, then we'll be decent. But if I
Mm.
do that wrong turn, then yikes, we're gonna have to take an extra 2, 5, 10 minutes, and every one of those things feels like pulling teeth,
Hmm.
because it's just like, well, I wasn't supposed to be here.
Hmm.
And so that's the thing that at least comes through in my story. The thing that
Yeah.
God is bringing to me right now. I mean, it's like a super specific thing, but
Yeah.
yeah, I
It's
grew.
real though. Well, it's not good. Like, it's not good, but what you're sharing, the depth is good.
Yeah. So, and just to give a little bit of context to, like, I have a Persian background with my mom's dad, or from my mom's side.
That is helpful to share.
And then for my dad's side, it's a Mexican side. And my grandpa from my mom's side was the first one who came over from Iran or Iran. And then for my dad's side, they've been over here for a couple of generations in the Texas area. It has been a long story. And like, I'm super proud of my parents and where they've come to now. And I think they've broken a lot of those generational curses that were, yeah, just something that ran through so heavily. And so I'm super proud of them for being able to change that direction. But now it's like, okay, now I'm at this fork where I am the one that the change has impacted. So where can I go? Where can I take this? And what will I/we produce in the next generation?
I am curious because obviously, I'm hearing you say a lot about the language of generational curses. And I do believe that there are spiritual elements in across generations passing on both curses and blessings. So first of all, hear me say, like, I do believe that it's a thing. I also have had conversations with more like mental health professionals, such as Dr. Andrea Holman, who was on the podcast just recently. And I think I've talked about this before, both on and off the podcast, that there's also the idea looped into generational curses when it comes to the Christian community, sort of like, we love to over spiritualize and like spiritually bypass like real psychological, actual mental health like things that are going on. And I wonder if you have anything. You don't have to add anything, I'm just curious if you have anything to say in the realm of like there being generational curses present within your family, but also just that sometimes it's not so much generational curses, like a spiritual cursing upon a house or something, but also just generational like norms or habits that have been sort of passed on and further stewed in the family norms across like generation to generation too.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad
think
that made sense.
I think it's definitely like overemphasized this idea of generational curses. It's always something that's like talked about in the church, and that wording or that verbiage is kind of used over and over and over again. It's like,
it really is.
Whoa, okay.
And then when we talk about legacy, which we were talking about at church, it's
true.
like legacy and generational curses get thrown out there often that I feel like they've lost all meaning.
Yeah, no.
But I'm sorry.
I
keep
agree
going.
in a sense. And yeah, I think there is, I mean, there's definitely a like mental / like physical or hormonal like impact that is made by, the actual mental health like makeup of who we are. Like different people will have different tendencies towards certain things. And some people may struggle with addiction more than others. Just the makeup inside of them affects them. Or like for me, I'm, my hormones, I'm going to be tending towards depression. And so it's something that I have to watch out for. And it's like ADHD too, passed down
genetically.
Yeah, genetically. And so it's like,
right.
Yes, there are probably some things that I saw or like ways that I saw people cope with things whenever they were overstimulated or whenever too much was happening. But also, yeah, I have a genetic makeup that's going to have me like tend towards these, like certain things like needing to stim, for instance.
Right.
Or having certain tics that happen sometimes.
Like needing to move your legs.
Yeah. And it's like, that is something that I will learn how to do it over time, but I do have a natural tendency towards it. And that's not a generational curse in my mind. Like, but it is something that the generations have dealt with. And so it's good to be aware of, but I also don't want people to have that like responsibility put on them of, oh man, there's this curse and you have to break it.
Right.
Because that's a lot to handle. Like that's what I'm talking about with the idea of how much pressure there is to like be this person or to change the things that are going on. I think it makes it almost a bigger problem sometimes for people than it has to be. Yes.
That's so well said. And I think, again, there's like another element, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but it's just one element though of again, like in often immigrant communities and even broader just like communities of color in the like family systems that we live in, it's not uncommon that that maladaptions happen. Like if,
Yeah.
for example, you know, my family, the Vietnamese side of my family coming over to this country as refugees, fleeing, not just fleeing a war, but fleeing actually like being murdered in their home country that we had been in for generations, you know, at this point, there's trauma affects more than just the mind. It affects your body. And when it affects your body and your brain chemistry, like you, there are certain, you do what you need to do to survive,
Yeah.
which is like a holy struggle in and of itself. It's just a matter of, I think, something that I have learned. I'm not prescribing this broadly, but this is more an observation through therapy and then also talking with like older saints, thankful for them. Shifting out of survival mentality and what does it mean to actually shift into a flourishing, thriving, like you are not under physical stress anymore, and leaving those maladaptations behind so that you can actually shift into identifying and engaging with, oh, that extra layer of stress that I'm experiencing is being multiplied by ADHD. And that's a whole other, that's not, it can be spiritual, but that's not necessarily a spiritual root. That's a genetic thing that makes your life harder. So yeah, being able to identify and sort of parse out those threads and even being given the space to look around and name and identify and engage with individual things like major depressive disorder, being diagnosed with autism or ADHD or neurodivergence generally speaking, or understanding what a panic attack is. Like actually being able to engage with those things is one, a privilege, but then two, is also something that can really only be done in like times of peace. Because when you're just surviving, you're just trying to get through the panic attacks, which I just feel like is worth naming.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned it earlier of like, you know, parents wanting to create this sort of bubble where you can protect them from outside things coming in and affecting who they are, making them be in these emergency situations.
Right.
And so you want to give your child space to be their own person or to be who the Lord has them becoming, which could be like very different or sometimes kind of similar to who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just wondering, hearing that and knowing your story of where you've come from, and especially like the reconnection with your Vietnamese side happening more recently, how does that feel like? Because there are kind of like, whenever you're unraveling these things, there are the fun things where you're like, man, I get to really enjoy these different aspects of culture that I'm able to reconnect with and feeling like you're part of this large community, because you are. But also there is like, you know that the community has this specific pain that you sometimes like that we see in ourselves. We're like, man, I didn't realize that thing was from these people. And like, I don't love that I have had to carry that my whole life.
Right.
And so how, I know that's a really broad question, but how do you balance those things and take time to enjoy the new things that are coming, but also being able to like react to the new information that affects all of the old things that you've been dealing with?
Oh, that's the whole question?
Sorry. I want to add on another piece to like make it more detailed, but
No, don't do that. Don't make it more detailed. Okay. So generally speaking, because wow, that question, it's a good question, and it also like has just lit up my whole brain. I can feel everything activating. One, and some context again for anyone who is just listening to this episode for the first time and doesn't know that much about who we are, it is worth mentioning that so my family, part of my family story and history is that my biological parents met and got married, were married for 10 years, had me and my little sister. They got divorced when I was 4 years old. There's a whole episode where I talk about more about the experience of divorce and the impact of being a child going through it. That happened. And there was also my mom remarried and we went through a second divorce. And ultimately those divorces, let me say this at least in a nutshell, ultimately those divorces we would say were both good for the sake of stepping into flourishing and safety in a number of different ways for my mom, my little sister, and me. So that's like a sort of brief backdrop to some of what I have to say. Because the other thing is that growing up in a divorced household where the primary custodial parent was my mom and the white side of me, and she did a great job of like raising us in such a way that my sister and I knew that we were Vietnamese And also, we didn't experience like shame or needing to like lock away the Viet side of us because that was the part where like pain came from or anything like that. So I say that for the sake of like kudos and many honors to my mom of the way that she raised us, because it could have been easy to do it a different way. But the other thing, there was a sort of like a sense of fracturing that I think happened when it came to cultural racial identity. That, again, I think I've talked a little bit about on the podcast, but I think I may have talked about it more out of the podcast. Where, yes, I grew up knowing that I was mixed, and I grew up knowing that my sister and I actually, we would use the term Wasian to refer to ourselves. And we grew up in Houston, which is the most diverse zip code in the country for the last 2 census data. So, I mean, we grew up around a lot of folks who, like, they heard the term Wasian and were like, oh, yeah, we know what that means. So there was an element of growing up, like, kind of knowing that these different pieces existed, which is great. That's something. But I didn't quite know how to integrate them and, like, how they all fit together within myself. Like, for example, when I was in junior high and high school, like, I was always, my last name was Win. So I grew up, with homeroom, there were like 5 or 6 other Wins that I got to know because we all saw each other in homeroom and we'd sit together for like general assemblies. So I knew that we were all Vietnamese. But I was the only one who didn't actually speak Vietnamese. So there was this element of, and I didn't have this language at the time, but I didn't really find myself hanging out with a lot of East Asians. And I kind of found myself like ostracized even from like the other Viets at my school because, one, I was half, and 2, I didn't actually speak Vietnamese, and I wasn't living with the Vietnamese, primarily with the Vietnamese part of my family. So there felt like a fracturing and getting to like connect with that community as I was growing up. And then what wound up happening is that I hung out with a lot of first and second gen like Latino immigrants, which was awesome and felt like home in its own time and space. And again, that's another story. But how that sort of has translated now is that as an adult, there's been a reconnection with my dad, the Vietnamese part of me, and then also the extended family on the Vietnamese side, because there was like a 10, I think really overall there's like a 10, 15-year period where we didn't really have contact with my dad, and also just because of him, also just the Vietnamese side of my family. So there were a lot of questions as far as like, who am I? Do I count? Am I Asian? Can I just say that I'm Asian, or do I need to preempt everything with saying that I'm mixed, I'm half, I'm Asian, whatever? How much of this do I need to preempt? And a lot of my adulthood has been engaging in, one, identifying mixed identity that I now claim, that I just wrote out on the desk in front of me, a capital M, claiming mixed identity as an identity unto itself. And at this point, I've written plenty of articles about also like just understanding the distinction that I am Southeast Asian, not East Asian, and that Southeast Asians in this country, we actually haven't been around. Filipino community has been around in this country for like a really long time. But outside of the Filipino community, there hasn't been a large wave of Southeast Asian immigrants until the like basically the 1970s, 1980s, which is relatively recent. So there's an element of like, I've experienced the gift of spaces where I have been able to dive into what does it mean to be mixed, and what does it mean to be Asian, and within Asian American, what does it mean to be Southeast Asian and Vietnamese specifically, that my family came here as refugees. We didn't come here because of like opportunity. Yeah. We came here for the opportunity to continue living, which just has a lot of intersecting, overlapping questions, and then how that all overlaps with also interacting with my dad post divorce, but now as an adult with the power dynamics shifting and just getting to interact with my dad for the sake of like, hey, who are you? Because the more I know about you, the more I've learned about myself, and the more I make sense to me, the more that I've dug into specifically the like Vietnamese roots of my story.
Yeah,
that feels like a good place to land.
That's a really good point about the value of digging into that. And yeah, like I said, kind of realizing that these things are like, okay, I'm getting a better idea of who I am whenever I'm able to see these kind of reflections or pieces that are, and I almost think of it like the light refracting into one place. And it's like
Yeah,
there are
that's
all these
really
different
good.
colors that come into it.
I
And
like
then you're
that.
like, okay, this is who I am. But yeah, so many things that make it up. And um, yeah, there are different parts of family too. Like sometimes there are family members that want to forget the culture that they've
Mm-hmm.
left or
Yeah.
that have been hurt by it and are like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
like my grandpa, my Iranian side, like my grandpa has connected us a little bit with that Iranian part of things of like
Mm-hmm.
making us food and, maybe singing songs or
Food is so
something.
important.
But, like he doesn't want that to still define who he is and who
Mm-hmm.
we are for the future generations. And
Right.
so it's kind of that crossroads where somebody has decided to take a certain step, like in the way of culture.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point on where the value comes from, and that it is important to know who you are and who the people around you are and who your family is and stuff.
Yeah. So with all of
It also
that,
helps you walk through all the issues that are going on too.
man, I feel like every time we keep covering really big topics. So woohoo. Everybody just take a deep breath.
Yeah, if this is the first episode you've watched, usually not going this big deal,
Yeah,
big topic.
take a deep breath and know
We'll talk more
that
about this.
we have essentially, if anything we've said at all has made like one or two lights sort of like come on in
Yeah.
your own brain, know that we have essentially covered what could be like 6 to 7 hour-and-a-half long episodes, much less conversations unto themselves. So we really have covered a large breadth of territory here. The hope being that we've just sort of sparked a couple of possible conversations or even questions that you can maybe take home,
Yeah.
ask yourselves, and even if you don't necessarily have contact with biological family or parents, or if you do, like being able to engage with your own history, story, family in whatever manner and context makes sense and is like good and right in your own shoes and context. And we always land on what is the invitation here to our listeners. I'm both extending the question, but I want to go ahead and answer it too. I would actually say that a really specific invitation that I want to extend to all of our listeners and viewers is really engaging and questioning what the roots of your faith are. And one, there's 2 Timothy 1 that talks about the faith of Timothy's grandmother and mother, Lois and Eunice, and that like a tradition talking about, cultural blessings and curses. There's a tradition of faith, and just generally speaking, when it comes to family, there's a heritage of like what's being passed down from one generation to the other. And even if you've lost contact with the generations before, just still asking the question of where you came from. And for me, there's been fruit in engaging with the fact that like on my mom's side, I have Catholic roots, and on the Vietnamese side, I have Buddhist and atheist roots. And then I've experienced everything from Presbyterian, Lutheran, actual non-denomination, to catching trauma at a Southern Baptist church, to working with an immigrant-led church and an Anglican church, and now we attend a Kojic church. Like engaging personally with my own trajectory of like faith traditions that I've engaged in has been really interesting and fruitful. So that's actually a very specific invitation of track, engage, ask questions with where your tradition and heritage of faith came from, because nobody comes up in a bubble, nobody comes up in a vacuum. So like, what are your thoughts on how you've engaged with faith and spirituality, kind of broadly speaking?
Yeah, and I think too, having the patience while you're going through it can be a little bit of a daunting process sometimes. Like you're trying to take so many things in from what the culture is, and so sometimes you're like drinking from the water arrows or drinking from the fire hydrant.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, there's a lot of things that to unpack here. And so giving yourself patience while you're like going through those things and being able to take time for yourself. And then also, like I said, kind of seeing the joy in who you've become and being able to see these things that have affected or impacted who you are, but knowing that you are a unique individual of yourself. And like that is a place to take joy, is that whenever we're talking about these things like generational curse and stuff, like it does get overemphasized a lot. But even just in being able to see what's kind of built up to who you are, like we're able to see that we are building something new. And it is very different for each one of us and should be celebrated. And sometimes we're building up things that we don't want to build up.
And taking time to name those things.
Yeah. And so just being able to identify those things and taking time for yourself and letting yourself know that, yeah, there are already things that you have made that are new. And so those limits that have been on other pieces of your family, they're not on you. Like we have something new to define, but it's going to be hard sometimes. So we've got to have patience with ourselves for that.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a good place to stop it. But yeah, it's been a fun conversation talking about it, and we'll definitely have to dive more into this stuff. And if
We'll
you haven't
revisit
already,
season 3.
yeah, this is going to be our whole thing, talking about kind of who we are, like where our identity comes from and stuff like this. And so we'll be talking more about the culture stuff.
Yeah, and what makes
Big part of who
you
we are.
you, what makes us us. So thank you for joining us for this conversation. As do the things, like, comment, share, subscribe, and if you haven't already, a big ask for us is that currently our whole podcast is actually funded by one Patreon donor. And I personally would love to be able to pay someone else to engineer our episodes, but we don't have enough money. So if you would consider joining the Chasing Justice Patreon to support, it actually does directly support this Beauty in Between podcast, and $5 a month actually pays for like 60% of one episode. So if we just had like 10 folks join at $5 a month, that'd be amazing. Just to sort of put that out there, because I tell people that they need to ask for help, but we should ask for support ourselves. So consider joining the Chasing Justice Patreon as well. The link is all over the place. It's in the show notes. It's in our Instagram bio, all those things. But otherwise, we are so thankful for each and every one of you for joining us for this conversation, for conversations beyond. We hope that it sparked some light bulbs, some thoughts, some questions that you can continue carrying on with in your local community. So thank you, and we will see you in the next episode.
Bye-bye.
The Beauty in Between podcast is part of the Chasing Justice podcast network. To find out more, go to chasingjustice.com. The best ways to support us and the podcast directly are by leaving us a review, sharing this podcast, and joining the Chasing Justice Patreon linked in our show notes.